Welcome back, everybody. My name is Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and this is going to be a very fun video because we're going to cover the SwiftfulUI framework that I have available for free on my GitHub. It is totally public, and you guys are welcome to use it. I'm covering it primarily because I've had a bunch of subscribers reach out to say that they are using it and they wish they knew about it earlier, and they wanted me to do a cover of it to explain how to use some of the components in the framework. So this framework is just a library of UI components. There's a whole bunch of different, basically random things. Everything in this framework is things that, while I've been building SwiftUI apps, I've noticed that I need this, and this is not in the SwiftUI framework. I'm gonna go build my own version, make it reusable, and then I'll throw it in this package. And so there's a bunch of different components in here. And in this video, we're gonna cover most of the big components in that package. It is all on my GitHub. You can go check it out on your own. There's actually documentation on GitHub as well, so you don't really need this video, but I think it's gonna be fun because we're gonna look at a bunch of these different components that you guys, I'm sure, have never seen before because they're all specific to this framework. But I use this now in all of my apps. It just saves me a ton of time while I'm building apps, and I'm guessing it's gonna save you a ton of time as well. So hopefully some of these you can actually use and leverage in your own apps. This is gonna be a fun video because we're gonna look at a bunch of random things that are gonna save you a ton of time in the future. So let's jump into Xcode, let's import SwiftfulUI, and let's write some code. Welcome back, everybody. This is gonna be an exciting video because we're gonna cover one of my personal packages. It's gonna be a UI framework. So I'm back in our project here. This project is Swiftful Thinking SPMs and SDKs, and I'm gonna right click and create a new group. Let's call this one UI helpers. There's a lot of packages out there that are related to kind of UI components. And one of them, of course, is the one that I have made myself. We are covering it again because I've had a bunch of people ask me to just run through some of it. What I'm gonna do is first go to the GitHub. So it's my GitHub here. I have two packages I'm going to cover in this series, SwiftfulUI, which is what we're going to cover now. And in the next video, I'm going to do Swiftful routing. SwiftfulUI is just a collection of reusable components, basically components that I have made over the last couple of years because I found that these components were not available in the SwiftUI framework. Some of them are better than others. Use them at your own will, of course. Most of the code is relatively simple, so you can create your own versions as well. Down here, I did create a wiki for this package. So all of these link into the wiki. You can always access the wiki up. To use a wiki on GitHub, it's like very simple. They're just a bunch of pages with some things that you guys can click on. For example, the buttons, and there's some documentation on how to use the buttons. So in this video, I'm just going to run through some of the more popular modifiers in this package, just because I think it's going to saves me a ton of time. And I think it might save you a ton of time as well. So let's go through it. I'm going to jump back to our project here. I'm going to right click, create a new file, SwiftUI view, and let's call this one SwiftfulUI Bootcamp. Click create. Let's import the package. I'm going to come up back to the package on GitHub. Let's copy the URL. Let's go back in here. I'm going to add it into my project target package dependencies. Let's add in SwiftfulUI. Do 1.1 to less than 2.0. Add package. Add package. Let's jump back in it. Let's import SwiftfulUI and let's get coding here. Again, I'm just going to run through some of the most common ones here, not in any specific order, but to show you some of the cool things that this does do. So firstly, let's go back to the wiki here. AsyncViewBuilders are for loading things asynchronously in a SwiftUI view. I'm going to do that one a little bit later. Let's start with the background and borders. So really simple, with background or with border. This is the same thing as adding a background with a color. So for example, I'll call with background. If I right click and jump to the definition here, we can see that it's literally just adding a background and a corner radius. If I look at some of the more complex ones, like with background and border, I can see here that there is a little bit of customization to add some padding with a special background and border that makes it look a little nicer. You can obviously, all the time, you can copy this, you can create your own modifiers as well. But this is really convenient for me. So with background and border, for example, let's do a background of color of .blue and border of .red. Let's do a border width of 2 and let's call a corner radius of 32. So with just this one line of code, I can now put a nice background on my button. So frame, max width, infinity. Let's go padding vertical. Put some padding outside of it. There's a lot of UI that revolves kind of around this UI here. So maybe this is actually like a white button with a blue background or something like that. This just saves me a lot of time in creating like the shapes and the backgrounds and the paddings and all of that. There is with background and border, with gradient background if you want to do it with an actual gradient, and then with gradient background animatable. So if you have more than one gradient and you want to animate between the gradients, you can use this one. For all of these modifiers, if you right click and jump to the definition, in these files within the package, you can see the code and you can also see the preview code. So I have previews in the package for everything. So if you're ever unsure how to use something, just come down to the preview code and then just copy the preview code like this. Go back into your project and let's just put in here preview view. I'll just rename this as SwiftUI Bootcamp 2. Let's comment this out real quick. All right, I'm gonna actually just cut all this and replace it with this view here. Let's see what this looks like. So here, we were animating between gradients on this button when I click it. Super easy to use. I feel like this is fairly difficult if you wanted to do it yourself. You can see here the actual code. Just a little annoying to have to write this every time. So convenience modifier to help you guys get going. That's the backgrounds and borders. Let's look at the buttons quick. We're going to do as button, which is the most common. So basically in SwiftUI, if you create a button, let's put the label here. The default state of this button is this sort of UI. When you click it, the button kind of shades as you click it. That's a default button press style. I don't like that style. I feel like it's very rarely used in apps. And I also don't like this syntax of having to create the button and the label every time. This is just a nitpicky thing, but this doesn't feel as convenient as like an on tap gesture. I already have an on tap gesture here. But so what I wanted to do was create a version of where I can write code as simple as this, but use it for buttons. And so in the package, there's an as button completion. And I usually use this one with the type here. And I added a couple types for convenience. So I usually use, so tap is like an on tap gesture, and then you have an action. So I could do this action in here, and I never need to call on tap gesture from my app anymore. I'll just use as button. And it's basically doing the same thing, except this, I also have convenience as press and tap. Press is probably the most common. So if I click it, it has the default, you see it like kind of, you can see it kind of scale in a little bit as I click it. That's the default press. And there's also opacity, which I rarely use, but it kind of just a slight opacity when you click on it. It's hard to see with the gradient here. You can also do just as button and customize your own. So for example, I wanted to scale a lot, make this 0.5. Let's go 1. Let's go 1. An action here. Let's cut this. I'm going to comment this out. So sorry, the brightness should actually be 0 by default. So now we have a really big scaling button as I click it because it's scaling down to 0.5. So you can customize this as well in your app. I personally just like this syntax as button much more than wrapping this text in a button. If you look at the definition of this, it is actually just wrapping it in a button and adding a button style. That's all it is. So again, just convenient stuff for you, for me. As web link is to open up a link into Safari. Async button I'll talk about in a little bit. Gonna hold off on that for a second. Fonts, I don't use these that much anymore, but there's just convenience if you want with font rather than adding a font and then another modifier for the color. I personally don't really use these anymore. They're still in the framework. Font animatable comes in handy sometimes if you're animating between fonts because they don't always animate in SwiftUI. Geometry Reader is a big one. It's one of my favorite ones. So the Geometry Reader, basically, I find really annoying to use. So for example, if I wanted to put this in a Geometry Reader, I would go like this, Geometry Reader. And if you've ever used a Geometry Reader, you get this like weird behavior where the Geometry Reader has its kind of own frame. If I put a background on this, color.red, it's super annoying. The Geometry Reader is automatically like this massive frame. I could try to put some padding around it and try to fix it. Generally, the Geometry Reader I find hard to work with, and I don't like wrapping my content again in another closure. So what I've created is a dot, you can call reading the frame or reading the location. So they're doing the same thing. One is just if you want to get the location, the CG point of the center, or if you want to get the actual frame. Frame is more common. So instead of accessing the geometry dot size like this, I'll instead just not use a Geometry Reader and call reading frame. And you'll notice that this does not change the actual frame of this view. And the reason that is because if I look at the code, if I look at this, it's actually adding it as a background to the view. So what is happening is putting a Geometry Reader, but on a background layer to the view. So it doesn't actually affect this view's frame, although we can still read what the frame actually is. So super convenient. And here I'll get the frame, and then you can do something with it here. So you might want to use like a state and get the frame dot height or size or width or min max or etc. I just use this more often than actually using a Geometry Reader because this is so convenient. If I call reading location, it's the same thing except this gives me a CG point and this gives me the actual full frame. But the code is basically the same under the hood. Let's comment that out real quick. Gestures are awesome. Magnification and rotation are, I think, rarely used in iOS apps, but the drag gesture is really helpful. So let's just go back into the code here. I have this button. Let's remove it as a button, and instead let's just add a .with drag gesture. Gestures are hard to use to write all that syntax every time, so I've created my own here. Do we want it to drag vertically or horizontally or both? The default is both, but let's go horizontal and vertical for now. Minimum distance. When you use a drag gesture, it's how far do I have to drag it before it actually starts dragging? So 0 is most common. Resets. After I finish dragging, do I want it to reset to the starting state? True. The animation, I'm going to use the default animation that's in the package. So I'll comment that out. Rotation multiplier, we're not going to add right now. Scale multiplier, we will not add right now. I have these two convenience functions here. So I'll click enter. This is the offset on change, and this is the offset on ended. So if I'm dragging this, while it's changing, this is going to execute and tell me exactly where the drag is. And if I let go when I drop it, this is going to tell me exactly where I dropped it. So we can use that for more complex UI. The resets here, when I stop dragging, if I make it as false and I stop dragging, it's going to stay where it is, which is super convenient. But most of the time I have this reset. So when I stop dragging, it kind of goes back to wherever it was. If I make this horizontal only, I can just drag along the horizontal axis, or vertical only on the vertical axis. I'll put it back to bold. I love the rotation and the scale multiplier. So rotation, let's just do 1.1. As I drag it, you'll see it rotate from side to side. This is great for like animating cards, if the user is swiping on cards or something like that. And then I also have in here a scale multiplier. So if I wanted to basically get bigger or smaller as I rotate it. So here it's getting a little bit smaller as I go towards the edges of the device. If I exaggerate this, you can see it get really small. I can also do a -2 and it gets bigger. Super convenient. I really like this. I know how to use the drag gesture. There also is with magnification gesture and with rotation gesture. You can use multiple of them at the same time simultaneously, but they all kind of work the same as the drag gesture. Moving on, we're going to look at grids real quick. Let's see what we have here. So let's come back in here. I'm going to let's comment all of this out. Let's come back up here. So SwiftUI has a lazy V grid. SwiftUI also has a generic just grid. I've covered both of those on my channel. Both of those should be used, but there are some edge cases where I find that those grids are hard to work with and they don't actually do every single UI that I want. So I've also created a non-lazy V grid and an H grid. So it's basically the same thing as a lazy V grid, except it works a little bit differently and it's not lazy because it's using just basic V stacks and H stacks under the hood. For example, I'm going to make maybe, let's do 3 columns, alignment to the leading edge, spacing 16. And then the only thing for this is that these items have to be identifiable. So up here, let's create a struct called SumItem that's identifiable. Let ID equals UUID.string. And then let's just say let color equals .red. So in here, I'm just going to have @state private var items of type array of SumItem equals, let's just create a bunch of blank SumItems. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's do 5. Let's loop on the items, and then this will be each item in. And in here, I'm just going to put the item.color. You'll notice the items in here is optional. And that's because the way this works is if there is not enough cells for the row, it's going to be optional in that row. So very simply, I'll just say here, if let item.color, put on the screen. Make this color.red. There we go. Let's let this show in the simulator real quick. And non-lazy V grid, let's add some padding, 40. Maybe each of these have a frame with a height of 50. All right, so the thing I like about the non-lazy V grid is that it's not restrictive to columns. You can see the bottom 2 rows, bottom 2 cells are not the same columns as the top cells. Whereas if I used a native lazy V grid or a native grid, most of those cells, depending on how you set up the grid, are going to all have the same column alignments. So a little more flexibility here. I can also get rid of that if I want to put an empty view for the blank cells. If I want to put a text here for the blank cells. I can also have each of these columns to be a dynamic size. So for example, let's do another frame with a width, and we'll say if item is equal to items.first, let's do 50, otherwise nil. They're not equatable, so let's match the IDs between the two of them. So now I can have, 3 different cells here, and this one is a little bit smaller. Just a little more customization. Generally speaking, I would say try to use lazy V grid. If that doesn't work, try to use a grid. If that doesn't work, now you have a non-lazy V grid to try out as well. I use this all the time. This saves me so much time than having to deal with all of the grid configurations. So now you guys know how to use it. Haptics. This was an old modifier I had with Haptic. It still works, but the Haptic APIs have changed recently, and I think the native SwiftUI ones are probably better than this. So I don't use those that often. Progress bars. There's a custom progress bar. Let's copy that real quick. Come back in here. Let's comment this out. This is your basic progress bar. It's crazy to me that this is not by default in SwiftUI. We have some progress bars, but they're not as customizable as this. So the selection here is the black line. Let's make the black line maybe red for a second. Selection, let's go 0 to 100 and select at maybe 25%. It's down here. So very easy to get a custom basic progress bar here. There's no like pin on this bar, like a little circle slider. But for a basic progress bar, this saves me a ton of time to use. Oftentimes progress bars are a little thinner, kind of like this. Maybe the background is gray and this blue, or maybe gray.opacity 0.5. And you have your basic progress bar. I imagine something like this is going to be added to the SwiftUI framework soon, but if not, now you have this as well. Redacted is a very fun modifier. So there's a .redacted modifier in SwiftUI where you can use the placeholder. We can't actually see it right here. Let's put in maybe an image with a system name heart.fill. We can see that it is redacted here. But I've just made a convenience modifier, redacted if. So I can add a quick Boolean, whether or not I want it to be true or like for loading. So I'll say if, let's say is active, and then we have placeholder, which is the one that you're seeing right now. I've also added just appear. So it just pops in, and opacity. So it animates in. So then we'll just take this out. And so we can't see it. Let's make this true. And all right. So if it is active and then just appears on the screen, or it's a placeholder until it comes on the screen. Super simple. Again, not crucial that you guys use that one. Scroll views are super convenient for scrolling to location. I'm not going to cover this in this video because, as I just recently covered in the SwiftUI continued learning, there's a new way to do scroll views in SwiftUI. There's new syntax and new modifiers for scroll views. Check out the end of the continued learning playlist if you want to learn those. If you're building for below iOS 17, this is super convenient. You basically just create instead of using a scroll view, you use a scroll view with scroll to location. And then you can just add in here where you want it to scroll. So super convenient. The one caveat is the same as using the native modifiers. So if I look at the scroll to location, this is just taking your content, putting it into scroll view, putting it into scroll view reader, and then animating it to that correct cell. So if you're building for below iOS 17 and you need that scroll to a specific index, this is incredibly convenient and you never have to worry about using a scroll view reader again. But if you're building for above iOS 17, go and use the native modifiers. Those are going to be better than this. Down here, real quick, I'm just going to cover a couple final ones. LazyZStack, this is a crazy complex, probably the most complex out of anything in this package, but a LazyZStack is if you took a bunch of views and then stacked them all in the same Z-stack and then wanted to show one at a time. So like there's a selection state and you're showing only one of those views at a time, you can use a LazyZStack. If I look at the docs here, again, the previews all work. So you guys can actually just come into the docs yourself. So here in the preview here, I can't even explain the code to you guys because it's recursive and very complex. But in the preview, there's a couple examples. An example using a Boolean, another example using a Boolean, integer, and using identifiable. And so in the preview here, if I click these, you can see how nice these transitions are. So the time to use a LazyZStack is if you're putting a bunch of views in a Z-stack and then you only want to show one view at once, and you want to use a transition to animate between those. When you do that manually, those transitions get really funky. If you ever worked with transitions in SwiftUI, there's like a lot of problems with them. Sometimes it's like it works one way and it doesn't work a second way. Well, this LazyZStack solves it. So all you need to do is add a LazyZStack, which is the same thing as an any recursive view. So for example, I'm going to copy this one here. Let's go back into my code base. Comment this out. I'm going to paste in any recursive view. And let's just make a selection index of type int, and we'll start it at 0. Should compile. And I think it's actually called a LazyZStack outside of the package. And it does get a little tricky to work with this sometimes. I'm still trying to finesse this component. Looks like the SwiftUI simulator can't figure out what value is. So I'm just going to make sure that it is of type integer. We can see number 1 on the screen here. And let's just add a quick dot on tap gesture. And when we tap it, we'll say selected index plus equals 1. We should probably animate it. We'll add some animation. Dot ease in on change of the selected index. And you can see here, it animates off, but you can see how nice the transition is, right? So the slide works perfectly. If I change this to maybe opacity animation dot ease in out, we can see that got a super nice transition there. Maybe I want to do dot scale. So these transitions all just work out of the box now, and we don't have to worry about some of those extra configurations. The any recursive view is also called a LazyZStack. It's the exact same thing. I usually just refer to it as LazyZStack. This is a difficult one to use, but it will save you a ton of time if you can get the hang of it. I advise you to look at the previews before using it in your app because it is a little difficult. Moving on here, there's a tab bar here if you want to make your own custom tab bar. You add your tabs and then you add the tab bar here. I do not use this anymore. It is not as performant. It works for sure, but it is not as performant as the native tab bar. And for that reason, I don't worry about custom tab bars anymore. You guys are welcome to go ahead and just copy some of this code, test it out. I think for simple apps and new MVPs, this code works perfectly. But if you have a big production app with thousands and thousands of users and you really care about performance, I would probably shy away from custom tab bars. There's also a custom toggle here, which just allows you to customize the colors in the toggle because the native SwiftUI one is a little difficult to use. Before we wrap up, I just want to briefly talk about the async stuff again. AsyncViewBuilders. Firstly, let's actually do async button. Async button lets you basically have a button with an action and it will tell you if that action is currently performing. So if I come in here, let's comment this out. Async button, shout out to Rookie Stone if he is watching this. We'll just say here, if is performing action. So if I click it and this asynchronous method is still executing, is performing action is true. So now I can have a button in my app and then I have a loading state for the button very easily. In a similar kind of note, there also is a AsyncViewBuilder and an AsyncLetViewBuilder. ViewBuilder is if I want to load some data, this phase will tell me if it is loading, if it's successfully loaded or has it failed. And then AsyncLet is the same thing, except if I have two functions, two async methods that I want to execute at the same time, this will tell me when both of them have succeeded. I generally shy away from using these in code bases just because of the way that I architect my apps. But if you're using some sort of MVP and you want a quick way to load some data onto the screen, this is really, really simple. You just come in here. You just create an AsyncViewBuilder. You have your fetch request here. The cool thing about this is you can literally fetch any data type and it's going to return that type back. So for example, if I have a func, let's say get some data, let's make it asynchronous and throws, and let's have it return a string. And here, let's just add in a 2-second delay, and then let's just return some string. What I can do is I can call get some data in this closure, and then the success will know that this is the new data, which is a string. So here I can put on the screen text new data. So as soon as this loads, this view builder should execute this function. It takes 2 seconds and then it appears. And this is cool because now I have a nice loading phase for my loading state, my success state, or my error state. So similar to like what we do with images, I can now do with any sort of data, just fetching this data from wherever. This is super convenient, although it kind of restricts you for like, for example, this executes as soon as the view appears and things like that. But now you guys know it's there. Again, for MVPs, this is going to save you guys a ton of time. I use it all the time. And yeah, that is it for AsyncViewBuilders. All right. And there's a couple final things before I wrap up this video. ViewModifiers on notification received. So within the iPhone, there's actually notifications like app did become active that trigger all the time, and you can trigger your own as well. And so if you're triggering and you want to receive one of those in a SwiftUI view, just use on notification received. So for example, now I can execute this closure anytime application did become active. And there's a bunch of these. If you want to do methods for any of these, a lot of your app delegate methods are in here. You can also set your own internal notifications and then listen to them in a SwiftUI view. I do that pretty often. It's an architecture pattern that's not super common anymore with SwiftUI, but this makes it super easy to work with that. On first appears, if you want to execute something the first time it appears, on first appear. I use that in every single app, as well as on first disappear, which is the exact opposite. As I said before, these notifications, often a lot of these are the default notifications from your app delegate. So in SwiftUI, we no longer have the app delegate anymore, but a lot of apps now have like a custom @app delegate that you've probably had to create. I actually try to avoid that in my apps because I don't like that the app delegate is outside of the SwiftUI view, and it's hard for me to move the data from the app delegate to the view. I think a lot of SwiftUI developers have that same problem. So one thing that I've started using is actually a view here. I've created a root view. So I will wrap my entire app in a root view, and the root view has a delegate, which basically gives me all of those application app delegate methods in a SwiftUI context. So oftentimes I will just come here and I'll do, if this was like the start of my app, let's say this is the first screen of my app. Before we get to the first screen, I'll actually add in a root view, and then I'll put in my actual view in the content here. So it looks the exact same on the screen, except now I have access to all of these methods. Application will enter foreground, did become active, will resign active, did enter background, and will terminate. The only one I don't have is application did finish launching, because that actually happens before the SwiftUI view hierarchy appears. If I hold the option and click on this, I've actually written some details here if you are curious on how these work. So easy way to get all those notifications at once, or you can just listen for a specific notification here. Two final things I have is a CountdownViewBuilder. This is just a quick, if you want, it's here. And let's just add some time. Let's put the end time here as date.adding time interval of maybe, let's say 60 seconds times 60 minutes times 24 hours times. So CountdownViewBuilder is if I want some sort of view where it tells me how much time is left until this end date. I don't know why, but I've had to use this in many apps so far. So this is just a countdown to that date. And it has logic for basically every time the user reopens the app, this will update to your new end time. If the timer goes down to 0, so maybe it was just like 60 seconds into the future, when it hits 0, the timer ends and you can execute this code here. You can also change it to time as hours, minutes, seconds for a little different UI here. Cool. Last thing I'll show is the Stretchy Header, which is a super fun one. This is how you use it. Basically, let's come back into Xcode. Let's go as Stretchy Header. And I'm just going to copy the preview and come back into my project. Let's comment that one out. So the Stretchy Header is basically, let's remove the padding outside of this actually. There's some padding here. So if you ever use like Spotify, there's a header that when you scroll, it can stretch a little bit. And I got really tired of rewriting all that code and dealing with the offsets. So Stretchy Header is basically a one line of code where you just set your starting height. So maybe I wanted to start at maybe 250. And then whatever content you want will be just a stretchy header. This is made to work with the header being at the top of the screen. But I think you could also just, if you look at the code in as Stretchy Header, you could probably very easily customize it for your use case. Cool. I'm always adding things to SwiftfulUI. It is a fun package to use. It's pretty lightweight. So you can I just add it to all my apps on the fly because it does save me time here and there. I hope this will help some of you guys in the future create some cool UI. If you want to add anything to this package, definitely open up a PR, open up issues. If you see any issues, open up PRs if you want to add anything. I am definitely down to make this much more of a community project. The only thing is that I'm only going to approve things that are actually fully reusable and useful to SwiftUI developers. So I'm not just adding any code in here because it's fun. I'm adding things that are not in the SwiftUI framework that I have then customized to make reusable enough to use in all of my apps going forward. All right, that is SwiftfulUI. I hope you guys enjoyed it. The next video is going to be Swiftful routing, which is so much more cooler than this one, and I'm very excited to share it with you guys. Thank you all for watching. As always, my name is Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking. If you like this package, please do not forget to star it on GitHub. That does help me out. It's got 150 stars, but I think we can get much more as this package starts to grow. Thank you guys for watching. As always, my name is Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.